Thanks everyone for joining. It's the last breakout session block of the ESIP meeting for the January meeting, so thank you for joining us. I'm going to go ahead and hand it right over to Jessica Morgan for Federal Partner Engagement session.
Great. Wonderful. So thank you. I we're going to introduce folks to our speakers, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about what this session is, but also give you some background on this kind of ongoing session topic. And at the end of this session, we are going to ask you to tell us, what do you think about for future topics? So this is a federal partner engagement session, okay, on a particular topic, OGDAs. You're going to hear a lot about that. But so what do we mean by federal partner engagement? So within the ESIP family, you may be aware that there are 3 U.S. federal agencies who are sponsor agencies for ESIP. ESIP is a nonprofit, and it gets funding from my agency, NOAA, from NASA, and from USGS. And we are proud to sponsor ESIP. We love it here. Why are we doing this? Well, actually, because there's a law, the Evidence Act, that says that agencies shall interact, engage with the communities of practice. And for our 3 federal agencies, part of how we do that is literally supporting, promoting, attending, participating in ESIP things, ESIP meetings, and ESIP clusters, ESIP. Okay. So last year, our 3 agencies got together and said, hey, there's a particular topic that was front of mind last year. Let's do a session, the 3 of us, and get some feedback, get some engagement, and then think, okay, for the next ESIP, what topic do we want to bring to the ESIP family? And I would love for our 3 agencies to have a similar session every ESIP. So at the end of our session, one of the Slido questions is going to be, what kind of topic do you want to hear about next? ESIP July in Austin, ESIP next January, virtual. We want to hear from you what federal policy topics are interesting. We've heard a lot of conversations over the past several days about things like Information Quality Act, data licensing, persistent identifiers for grants. Are these topics that are interesting to you? And we want to get that feedback, and then we'll go into our agencies and say, hey, we heard these topics are of interest to the ESIP community, and we will make that happen. Okay. So with that, I also want to take a minute, well, first to introduce who we are. So I'm Jessica Morgan, emphasis on the Morgan because my counterpart at NASA, Jessica Burnett, also known as NASA Jessica. So I'm NOAA Jessica. I'm the Assistant Chief Data Officer for the NOAA Satellite Service. I'm joined by 2 other Assistant Chief Data Officers from NOAA. So Joe Fillingham is the ACDO for our staff and corporate offices. That is WONK for headquarters. And he is the data governance lead for our agency. We also have Michael Liddell, who is an Assistant Chief Data Officer for the NOAA Fisheries Service. And so we've got our 3 of the 7 ACDOs at NOAA here with us. From NASA, we have Jess Burnett. And then from USGS, we have Leslie Shee. And they will tell you more about who they are and where they sit in their various chains. So I want to remind us all that we are, an ESIP family. Reminder, by participating in this session, we all agree to adhere to the ESIP community participation guidelines. This session is being recorded and will be archived for future viewing. When we get to the discussion section, we're actually going to stop the recording and people can turn on their cameras and things. But we're going to have 3 presentations, and we're also going to have the Slido situation happening. So there is a welcome poll on Slido. The link to it should be in the chat, and there's a couple of questions about like, who are you? What are you hoping to learn from the session? And then as we go through, there will be a couple other specific questions and then a bunch at the end. So again, we're going to have 3 presentations. We'll have a little bit of like Q&A in between, but we'll save most of the questions for the end. So next, what is this topic about? Okay. So federal partner engagement, right? We are your 3 federal agencies. The topic that we picked for ESIP January 26 is essentially what's up with data as an asset. Okay. So for all of this time, we've been talking about capital D data, data sets, data products, data streams, data. And across all of our different roles and sectors, we all use different words, right? Within the federal space, we have a piece of legislation called the Evidence Act, and Joe is going to walk you through what is the Evidence Act. It very specifically in the law describes data assets and says agencies shall manage their data as assets. So we're going to talk to you today about what that means for our 3 federal agencies. Our goals are to promote awareness, right? We want everyone who's going to use federal data to be aware of this sort of thing. We want to engage with you. We want to hear your questions. We want to try to answer your questions, but we really, really appreciate the written short answers that you put into the Slido and the questions that you put into the chat. We capture all of that and we take it back to our agencies. We want that engagement. And we, as agencies, want to be able to improve our situation, not just for ourselves as agencies, but you are our users, right? And you are our partners. So this is one of the many ways that we're trying to reach into the community and promote awareness, really try to engage, and then ultimately improve the federal science agency situation. So I'm putting a whole bunch of questions up here. This is all nonsense right now. When we get to the discussion question, we're going to have learned about things like the question of a logical grouping of federal data assets. All these words have meaning, right? We're going to learn about public data assets versus open data assets, and what's the difference, and is one more useful, or does it even matter? And we're going to think about the federally mandated metadata that's a little bit different from what we traditionally think of as scientific metadata. So I'll put these questions up again at the end and when we switch to our discussion mode. Okay, so with that, we're going to switch to our first presentation. Joe Fillingham, again, Assistant Chief Data Officer for Staff and Corporate Offices. I will say, so first of all, Joe, this is your first ESIP meeting, right?
Kind of. I've attended sessions before, but this is my first presentation at an ESIP meeting. I think we'll put it that way. Yeah.
Yeah. So I've been trying to get all of my brethren in NOAA to actively participate. So yay, Joe and Mike, yay. But also, so Joe is our go-to policy guy, okay? And I roped him into this because this is a policy topic. So thank you, Joe, and take it away.
Thanks so much, Jessica. I was just scrolling through the participants, and a lot of friends and colleagues from NOAA, from NCEI, from Unidata, and from other organizations. Glad to see you. Thank you guys for coming and listening. Really appreciate it. So yeah, as Jessica said, I'm the NOAA Data Governance Lead and ACDO for staff in corporate offices, I work directly for the NOAA CDO, and so partner and work closely with all of the line offices and kind of service elements across NOAA to keep our policies, our governance structure, everything moving forward and chugging along. So this topic is near and dear to me and is very relevant and timely. So excited to talk a little bit about what this looks like. I'm going to take the approach of thinking a bit about NOAA data governance in general and how the concept of data assets might fit into that. I'm going to leave some things a bit open-ended, and I'm looking forward to hearing from my USGS and NASA colleagues as well, kind of their perspectives on Evidence Act implementation and data assets. And then, obviously, as Jessica said, would love to hear from the community, from the broader group. Where are we close? Where are we way off? All that kind of stuff. I think it would be really exciting discussion to have. So next slide, please, Jessica. I wanted to start off with kind of this baseline that I think in general we can do better, right? In terms of data governance, in terms of data management, there's a lot that we can do in NOAA to get better. I think the challenge that we have is that we maintain a governance framework that's based solely on the data management lifecycle. And there's nothing wrong with the data management lifecycle. There's nothing wrong with data management. Those are essential steps that help maintain our data integrity, our scientific integrity as an agency. But they don't leave a lot of technical emphasis, or they don't have a lot of technical emphasis on the FAIR principles and things like access, reuse, interoperability, things like that are not always the central focus. It's much more how do we make sure that we're documenting and preserving data and along the way, provide access. But how do we enhance that? How do we do better in that domain? And I think that's where our focus is currently, and making some steps forward in that space. And so, both in terms of mandate, but then and statutory requirement, but also in terms of strategy, right? We can think about shifting the way we're um, uh, the way our governance structure is framed to think more about data as those kind of mission focused strategic assets, right? What is our mission? Science, service, and stewardship. How do we create strategic data assets in that context, right? And what does that mean in terms of FAIR principles and how we want to implement those FAIR principles? So it's a bit of a culture change, right? In terms of how we're thinking about data governance, how we're thinking about data management, and what is that end goal, right? So in a lot of ways, I think across NOAA, we manage data to ensure that it's preserved, or we manage data to make sure that it lands in the archive, or we manage data and document it, and then that's the end of the conversation, right? Rather than having that strategic asset goal in mind that's tied to that mission use, whether it's an AI-ready data set for numerical weather prediction, or stock assessment, and on and on and on, right? That's the thought process here, is how are these data going to be used, and how are we thinking about this term asset in that context? Next slide, please. I think in a lot of ways we manage our data and we create what could be considered assets today, but we're challenged by this idea that much of that is not coordinated universally across the agency, and it's definitely not something that we're coordinating interagency in an interagency way. So a lot of program specific, a lot of assets are not necessarily standardized, and they're not supported by many enterprise tools. That's not to say we don't have enterprise tools, but it's not to say that there are a standard set of enterprise tools that ensure that all NOAA data assets are treated in that standard way. And in many ways, this lack of coordination limits the way that we can create a comprehensive data inventory, from data collection to preservation, to have that catalog that can be as useful as we need it to be, and to take those steps forward in terms of AI readiness and how we're thinking about the true cost of data management and data governance throughout the data management life cycle, and including that in our budget planning and I think that's a big area to touch on when we're thinking about data assets going forward. Next slide, please. And so let's shift a little bit. And I think it's important to establish some context around the Evidence Act in general. So there's some definitions in the Evidence Act, but the Evidence Act, its full name is the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act of 2018. Sometimes it says 2019, right in that 2018-2019 timeframe. It was passed during the last Trump administration, interestingly enough, and it is really focused on improving federal policy making and the kind of transparency and data-informed decision making that goes along with that. The Evidence Act establishes the chief data officer position in all of the federal agencies and the need for a data governance body through which a lot of these decisions around data management and data activities are made. And so, to Jessica's earlier point around engaging with the broader community, that is essential to making sure that we have these informed bodies, et cetera, et cetera. So, with that context in mind, shifting to some of the definitions that are included there, and these have extended into, at least in NOAA, the way that we have established our policies for data management as well, right? So defining data as recorded information, regardless of form or media on which the data is recorded. So all data. And I think that is kind of an essential baseline for a lot of this. A data asset is defined in the Evidence Act as a collection of data elements or data sets that may be grouped together, which is very vague and very broad and doesn't provide a lot of tangible reason about why are we grouping these data elements or data assets. What is the context through which grouping them is better than not grouping them? And I'm going to come back to that here in just a second. A public data asset is simply a data asset that is made publicly available, maintained by the federal government, that has been or may be released to the public. And then extending beyond the public data asset, an open government data asset is simply a public data asset that has specific attributes associated with its openness. So machine readability, open formats, not encumbered by any restrictions, other than, say, maybe IP and things like that. And then the list goes on and on and on. And we're going to come back to that at the end. I'm going to hand it back to Jessica to talk a little bit about data asset metadata and how that kind of connects across this domain. But next slide, please. But I'd like to take a step back from that, honestly, and think a little bit about what is an asset in general, because words matter. I want to put that up front, right? When the federal government is talking about definitions and words, and then working with various sectors, whether it's the private sectors or NGOs or the academic, if we're talking about two different things while trying to enhance accessibility, usability, interoperability, then we're never going to get anywhere. And so I think this is really important. What is an asset? So an item of value to an interested party or organization, right? I think that is essential. Something of value, whatever that might be. So we're going to come to that in a second, and you can think about value in a lot of different ways. But the definition that I pulled from this NIST article was more about the kind of counterfactual and consideration of loss. What is the impact that might have if you don't have that available to you? So I think data fits into this very well, but interesting to start there. Next slide, please. So then what is a data asset? If an asset is simply something of value, then ones and zeros from a sensor are an asset, right? They are of value because we can do things with them and then have, added value, built through that process. So then our data assets, are those really just data products? Because what are we talking about in terms of value? Are we talking about kind of those ones and zeros, or are we talking about how the data are used and how that use or not having those data available then create value? You can see how this gets a little bit confusing. And I wanted to quote Jed, a good friend of mine. He's participated in ESIP sessions before. He does a lot of cloud native work through Radiant Earth and other places. But I thought this was really interesting. So a data product is simply data you intend to share, talking about data products forces practical questions. Who uses it? How much it costs to produce? What value it delivers? And who will build and maintain it? So I think this is an interesting parallel, right? Are we talking about data products or are we talking about data assets? Are these one and the same thing? I don't think so, but let's talk about that. So next slide, please. I also want to poke a little bit at other statutory frameworks and other statutory definitions of things. I'm not going to get into this in too much detail, but the Information Quality Act or IQA guidelines or IQA, and then the guidelines that NOAA has produced based on that define things like original data, synthesized products, interpreted products, and have different requirements and different elements associated with each of these things. So I think that is interesting because if we're talking about kind of a universal space within which we're talking about data assets, we want to not be inclusive to one set of statutory requirements. We want to think about all of them. And so original data, maybe kind of in the form of what others might call raw data, versus a synthesized product that might use some sort of analysis, statistical method, model or algorithm to create kind of a different level of data, versus interpreted products, which is a different way in which to create new data based on that original data. I think this is meaningful and should play a role in the way we're thinking about this. Next slide. And so going through this thought process led me to this. Now, this is a very much a first pass, and I'm not saying this is no policy and this is not vetted in every corner, right? This is very notional and is kind of throwing something out there to the community for discussion, and something that will continue to develop. Jessica and I represent NOAA at a Department of Commerce level working group that's looking at definitions for data assets, that's looking at implementation of the Evidence Act and things like this. And this is a very timely discussion because that working group met this week and is going to meet again next month and is going to dive into these definitions in a meaningful way. And we're hoping to pull from this discussion and from our colleagues from NASA and USGS as well to inform how we're thinking about that. So first pass. Maybe we can define a data asset as a collection of data or data sets that together complement or enhance the use and decision-making power of the data. So taking a step beyond just saying a random assortment of data, a random collection of data, but thinking about data that, when brought together, complement the use or enhance that decision-making ability that those data are intended for in the first place. And in many ways, this happens in different parts of NOAA and other agencies, right? So I'm thinking of my colleagues at NCEI and a lot of the products that are developed there, some of the intentional collections of data in the NOAA data archive and the way in which those are intended for, that particular use. But then how can we extend that? How can we build on that and think about that as data assets? So taking a step beyond what the Evidence Act is saying, which is just simply a kind of a foundation, right? That a data asset is a collection of data or a grouping of data, and then thinking about how do we make that meaningful? How do we make that useful? Okay, next slide, please. So I want to poke at this data asset, data product thing a little bit. And I may not have this exactly right, and I'm sure that folks will have thoughts and feelings about this. But the way that I've been thinking about this is, and based on these definitions, is that you can have different data sets, and bringing those together in a meaningful way, like wood, screws, nails, glue, gives you the foundation, right? It gives you a way, an enhanced way to then use that data and or make decisions based on that data. A data product might come out of that data asset, right? A data product may be built from a data asset, and again, extending to a specific use or decision-making space. But that is almost another level, right? Where you're saying, I can take this data asset and then help use that to help address this one challenge or this one question, like eating dinner at a table, and then create that to move forward, right? So just throwing this out as maybe a way in which to differentiate, as I was teeing up before, this conflict between maybe data products and data assets, and in this way thinking about them in a meaningful way. Again, may not have this right, but throwing it out there for discussion. Next slide, please. And I think another important element of this is that we can't just have data assets by themselves. There are federal requirements and tangible things like intellectual property or the academic process and data quality and all these things that lead to uh, the necessity for different asset categories. So if we think about data, meaningful grouping of data that are brought together in a way that enhances their use to create a data asset, and then maybe data products come out of that data asset that are that much more specific for their intended use or their intended users. We can take that data asset and break it out into its component parts, right? And we could think about public data assets, which, as the Evidence Act states, are data assets that are made public, and maybe that's as simple as it needs to be. And then restricted data assets, because within the federal government, there's a whole list of things that relate to why a data asset might be, or a data set or data are restricted. Some of those things are personally identifiable information or business information. There are statute like the Magnuson-Stevens Act, and fisheries. There are an intellectual property all data quality limitations, all these things that might lead to a restricted data asset. And in some ways, maybe there should be an arrow between the restricted and the public data asset, because some restricted data may be able to be made public at some point in the future, depending on changes to those policy or requirements, changes to how that data is processed, or limitations on things like IP, et cetera. And then the most important element, which is what we're going to get into in more detail here, is the open government data asset, which is that next layer beyond public data asset, where we're thinking about data that is fully open and all the attributes that come along with that. So next slide, please. And so here's an example of what those attributes might look like. And I'm going to hand it back to Jessica here in a second, and she's going to talk a little bit about how in statute, there may be some additional details and flavors of what we think about when it comes to open government data assets. But when you expand upon this, right, when you look at data with file level metadata and you go to a data asset, you might move to a layer of complexity where you're adding a different level of metadata, an asset level metadata. And again, we'll talk about that more in a second. And that as you go through these different categories, you're adding levels of stewardship, layers of complexity that are focused on how they may be used. And I do want to flag that I think there's some interesting discussion that can come out of this. Maybe some of this is internal to federal agencies. Maybe the community can be, an integral partner in figuring out how this looks. But when we're talking about open government data assets, yeah, openness is the goal, right? We want as much as possible to be open, but that requires resources. It requires time and expertise that doesn't always exist for every data asset that either the federal government or a particular agency or that exists in general. And so how do we prioritize what becomes an open government data asset when you're thinking about all these different added layers of stewardship that come along with that? And I think that's, again, some of that prioritization and strategic thinking happens in agencies today. There are things like using, again, paralleling to other statutory frameworks, geospatial, under the Geospatial Data Act, thinking about national NGDAs, National Geospatial Data Assets, and other categories, highly influential or influential scientific information under IQA. Right, there are ways in which some of these things are evaluated and thought about to kind of draw those lines, and maybe those are things that we can extend into this space to make this a bit more concrete or meaningful. So with that, I'm going to stop going on and on from kind of a policy perspective. I've thrown out some notional ideas. I've thrown out some ways in which we can think about data assets in the context of what an asset is, something of value, and paralleling that with data products and other kind of statutory frameworks. But I'm going to hand it back to Jessica, and she has a couple of slides to kind of extend on the metadata part of this, because there may be some really valuable input from this community and all the technical experts here that can contribute to that. So Jessica, I'll hand it back to you.
So thank you, Joe. That was awesome. Okay. And so there's going to be more Slido questions about the things that Joe was talking about, logical grouping, open versus not, all those things. But thank you, Joe, for giving us that, like, what is the Evidence Act? So a quick sidebar about the data asset metadata. And so we have a Slido question about this topic. Okay, so Joe showed you part of the Evidence Act that explains what are the section in there that's about the data assets. There is another section that explicitly, very helpfully, defines asset level metadata. It says the head of our agency shall put all of this to the maximum extent practicable in a comprehensive data inventory, metadata with all this stuff. Okay, so this is too hard to read. Here's a simpler version of this. Okay, so this is mandated metadata fields in the Evidence Act. Okay, so to be quite honest, we hadn't really been thinking about this in our agency when we were, over the past 20 years, constructing our scientific collection level metadata requirements, right? At NOAA, our collection level metadata is based on ISO. A lot of the stuff is in the ISO somewhere, but we hadn't really been thinking about this as asset level metadata. But okay, let's get real. We've got a piece of legislation that says we should do this, and there are 10 things that need to be attached to every data asset, not every data set, not every data product, every data asset. Okay. So what's really interesting to me is that some of this is like, totally normal sorts of things that you would see in metadata, right? But and there's room for aspirational other things, but just kind of looking through it, description, yeah, including all the variables and their definitions in one place. Great. Title, asset determination, and when we decided it was an asset. So as Joe said, there are at least 4 different categories of asset. And we would put this right there and say, okay, there it is. 2 different pieces of restrictions. One is a formal confidentiality. There is an act called SIPC. Don't worry about the details unless you are in this field, but that's specifically confidential statistic information. Okay. But if you're not that, you should be probably public unless you have other use restrictions. Public access method. Okay. So that's going to change over time, right? We are decades away from FTP sites, right? But to be able to say in our asset, this is how we're going to make things publicly available. Okay. When did we last update it? Okay. The responsible agency and the owner. To be quite honest with you, this is sometimes very tricky. Okay. We do a lot of partnering with each other. So not just other federal agencies, but other government agencies, right? So NOAA takes data from other government satellites and squishes them all together to give you a blended product. Who's the responsible agency? Probably NOAA, maybe NASA. I don't know. Who owns it, right? This is important to us. Is it important to you as the user and as the community to know this sort of information? So use restrictions, location. What does that even mean when we're all in the cloud? But okay. Now, at the very bottom here, any other metadata, this is quoting directly from the Act, any other metadata necessary to make the data asset useful. I'm interpreting this section 11 to be our standard collection level scientific metadata that we talk about all the time, right? And each of us has a different flavor of that, but that's where we put all the provenance and all of the, like all the other stuff, the geospatial, the blah, blah, temporal, all of that. We have the ability, the Act says, put anything that makes it useful. I challenge us to consider that to be anything that makes it fair, right? Okay, so I invite you to take a look at this list of things. If anything pops out at you as, hey, that is actually very useful and isn't typically in the kind of metadata that you're interacting with, that is great information for us to know. And so thank you for that. We're going to switch over. So we'll keep that Slido poll open until the next one. We're going to switch over to NASA now. So thank you, Joe. Joe will pop back up when we have our discussion session, but thank you for walking us through all that. So now we're going to turn this over to NASA Jess. There we are. Okay. And I have your slides up. So let me know when, and so you have a Slido poll as well. So let us know when you want that to pop up, and we'll do that behind the scenes. And
Sure.
You have 15 minutes. Okay.
You can hear me, right?
Yes.
Excellent. Yeah, you can go ahead and pop that Slido poll up. We can keep it open throughout the duration. Good morning, everyone. I'm Jessica Burnett. I am a program executive at NASA headquarters. I work under Katie Baines, who is our Earth Data Officer. She is one of the 5 science officers serving under Kevin Murphy, who is our Chief Science Data Officer. Just a bottom line up front, I really appreciate NOAA going over the nitty gritty of the 2018 Evidence Act and what we need to be paying attention to. I'll just say that for NASA, the Evidence Act largely reinforced our existing practices rather than driving any new change, particularly for Earth science. NASA's Earth science data already met and in many cases exceeded nearly all of the Evidence Act's Open Government Data Act requirements. However, we recognize that there's always room for improvement. And you'll notice throughout that we're particularly interested in logical groupings and how we represent that in our metadata. Next slide. Now, I'm sure that if you've gone to an ESDIS or a NASA talk this week, you might have seen this figure. What I want you to take away from this is that our Science Division operates one of the largest open archives on the planet. Our current archive volume, not including duplicates on-prem, is about 150 petabytes, and we're currently growing at about 160 terabytes per day, with incoming NISAR data adding about 60 terabytes a day. And so that's just to say that whatever we do or change about our archive has significant impacts throughout our organization. Next, please. Thanks. So from a NASA science perspective, again, the Evidence Act largely kind of codifies what we were already institutionalizing within our Earth science data system. We had no new operational requirements for Earth science beginning or since the Evidence Act was implemented. Our data are, by default and with very few exceptions, already free, open, machine readable, and public facing. NASA doesn't currently have any distinct definitions of what a public data asset is or what an open government data asset is beyond what is defined in the Evidence Act, as Joe kindly went over earlier. However, I will note that we do have what are called national geospatial data assets, which are governed by the Federal Geospatial Data Committee, which comprises, I think, at least 15 agencies across the government. And these national data assets that NASA holds are ASTER and MODIS from Terra and Aqua. Overall, our compliance is achieved through our existing stewardship practices, our open access policies, and our metadata standards. Next. And so, as I mentioned, there were no special remediations required for when the law was enacted. Oh yeah, that's a nice little image, huh? And so yes, we didn't have to do too much. However, we do aim to continually improve, as I recommended or I said earlier. So public data assets, our Earth data is already publicly released via earthdata.nasa.gov. Our data are standardized and provided in non-proprietary formats. Our data are arguably machine readable. They're designed for automated access and efficiency, and we employ open standards. That is, our data are required to use community adopted scientific and metadata standards, and we also have a very rich data set level metadata. Next. So logical groupings is kind of one of that big areas where we can think about how we can improve, not only for findability, but also for discoverability. So our logical groupings are really enabled by our metadata, which is managed under our common metadata repository. we already have these big groupings like mission level data, instrument level data, groupings by space and time. And we also have disciplinary assignments for our data. That is, if you go to our website right now, earthdata.nasa.gov, just as an example, we have these high-level, scientifically disciplinary relevant terms like atmosphere, biosphere, cryosphere, or sun-Earth interactions that are particularly useful for new users to enable that discoverability. And we're always striving to improve this, and we're interested in getting feedback from this session, particularly on this topic today. One thing that we are missing that I appreciate that Joe highlighted is that use or application of the data. What can the data actually be used for in a decision-making context? And this is a massive challenge. You know, I noted earlier that our current archive is sitting at about 150 petabytes. So to undergo any operational change in defining a metadata field as a use or application is going to take a lot of effort and feedback from the community. Next. And on to the boring stuff, unless you're a policy wonk like Joe, maybe. I'll just say that I just wanted to overview quickly how we are complying and reporting on the 2018 Evidence Act requirements. We too undergo an annual Evidence Act annual evaluation, and this is all public-facing information. Feel free to search for it. Our data.gov metadata submissions can be viewed easily across the agency by going to data.nasa.gov. We have an open data plan, and we also have SPD 41A, which is our open science information policy for the Science Mission Directorate at NASA. And so we're required to, and we already have these annual evaluations, the plan, the information policy. And our chief science data officer, who I mentioned earlier, is the one who leads up the charge in the science data space for these policies, plans, and strategies. Next. And so that was a really quick overview, just going a little bit into the NASA specifics with regards to what Noah, Jessica, and Joe said earlier. Why does this session really matter to us? Again, we're really interested in hearing the community's interpretations of these Evidence Act terms, especially the logical groupings, because that's where we can do a lot of improvement in the metadata space. We want this because we think that it will impact findability and discoverability. And we hope that what we learn here today will inform how we are logically grouping on the back end and on the front end to improve user access and readiness. And so I appreciate that, and I'll turn it back over to Noah, Jessica. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, NASA Jess. So we do have a Slido prompt there about the about mandated OGDA characteristics, and invite you to take a look at that. So far you've seen NOAA and NASA. Next is going to be USGS. And again, we're going to have an open discussion after Leslie's presentation. So let me yes, whoops, forgot. There's the Slido poll. Okay. And then Leslie, let us know when you want your Slido prompt to switch, and we'll do that.
Thank you, Jessica. I did see that it looks like there was a slide inserted, perhaps with the QR code. So I saw something in there, and that's a good time.
Okay, great. So thank you, Leslie. Take it away.
Thank you, Noah, Jessica. Hi, everyone. I'm here to give the U.S. Geological Survey perspective on this topic of open governmental data assets and what's happening in the USGS related to the Evidence Act. My name is Leslie Shee, and I'm with the USGS in the Science Data Management Branch. I have the role and perspective as a USGS Data Community of Practice Coordinator, and I think this gives me a pretty unique vantage point to see both the management and the practitioner experiences with open data. And I do interact with the USGS Acting Chief Data Officer, Chief Technology Officer, and some other associate directors as my role as the community coordinator. And this is a way to connect management with the practitioners. So I'm grateful for this ESIP venue to host this discussion with our different agencies. I think This is unique and really beneficial to us. So in my presentation, it's short, but I'd like to describe how the implementation of the Evidence Act filters down to different levels, including you. You may be a practitioner or data user. What would you experience and why? Next slide, please. So first, just one slide on USGS data, which is really difficult because USGS data spans many different earth and biological sciences. The images on the right are from a recent USGS publication called USGS, an Unparalleled Scientific Asset, and shows the breadth of our science and information. So not just geology, but delivering information to power our economy, manage natural resources, and keep us safe and healthy. So volcanoes, topographic data, invasive species, harmful algal blooms, big game management, floods, fires, gas, oil, geothermal energy, and groundwater for agriculture are just a sampling of some of the different types of data that we hold. And USGS is the science arm of the Department of the Interior, so we fall under Department of the Interior governance for our scientific data. And this third bullet is saying that present day USGS data releases are completed under requirements we have been refining since 2016 and earlier. They have rich metadata, persistent identifiers, open licenses, and are machine readable and open format. The little abbreviation there is to remind me for those last two features, it's stated every reasonable attempt is made to make them machine readable and in open format, as stated in the USGS Public Access Plan. Next slide, please. This is a screenshot of our USGS Science Data Catalog, which we in our branch are doing the best to let people know this is the public search and discovery tool and metadata catalog for all USGS data. USGS data can reside in many different internal and external data repositories and still be official USGS data. The purpose here, again, is to give you an idea of the breadth of USGS data holdings and how there is a lot of connections with our sister agencies. So that's another reason why these types of discussions to align and share information are so important. Next, stay here for a second. Please back. One key difference when I say USGS data compared to our sister agencies is that we do have a very large fraction of project level data collected or generated for discrete studies or publications, not necessarily national or more operational data sets. So we do have both, but a lot of that project level data, and that's a lot of who we interact with all of these requirements and implications of the Evidence Act. So our holdings may be smaller in volume, but they really are quite diverse. And a note that in our data strategy, we use the term data asset very broadly, encompassing both these official data releases and many other things. I did pop that definition into the notes page for this session just for consideration and discussion later. Okay, next slide. The next slide helps me describe one of my main goals of today, which is to explain to you how implementation of the Evidence Act may filter to and reach you if you're a practitioner using or generating USGS data. So starting on the left, we have the federal law, Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act of 2018. Grateful to my colleagues here who have explained that in more detail. This will get interpreted at the Department of Interior level. And since the Evidence Act, many activities have happened grouped under Evidence at the Interior. There's a link for that in the notes, and I'll show some screenshots in the following slides. Next, number 3, you'll get to the USGS level, and we'll work with what the Department of Interior has said and develop some our own USGS strategies and plans. But I do want to say, as a practicing scientist or data user, you may not necessarily really know about, read these plans. You have your own priorities of what you're trying to do. So these exist and they're very helpful to guide what we should do. But what happens? What do people see as a scientist or a practitioner? So the next level are the resources that are made to help you meet the policy. And in the USGS, some of those include our USGS data management webpage, USGS fundamental science practices documentation, what we call the survey manual chapters, the US Geological Survey. I think that some of my colleagues here, Joe and Noah, Jessica, would be very interested in reading those chapters, and also USGS Laboratory Quality Management System Guidance. Okay, so these are linked in most of these are linked in the session notes, and these resources would be the ones giving specific guidance on things like choosing an open license, using open formats and community standards, and so on. So if you're not a USGS scientist, you could still encounter some of these resources or the implications if you're collaborating with one. Or you could be asking a USGSer for a data or product and get outputs or responses that have been guided or constrained by some of these practices or tools that we have available. So I would like people in this session who are interested to know about them and have access to them. Okay, next slide. Here's a few examples so we can see the different levels. So here at the Department of the Interior level, this is interesting to me because sitting at I consider myself almost at the practitioner level. You might not necessarily know about these things, but they may eventually have a big impact on you and your work. So this evidence at the Department of the Interior page, these resources support federal transparency and capacity building. If you're interested in seeing similar resources for other departments, not just the ones in this session, I recently learned of the Evidence Act Hub. I think I can just show, I pasted that into the chat. It's another great place to go browse around if you're interested in that. Next slide, please. And this is just on the same page for the Department of Interior evidence. There's links to learning agendas, evaluation plans, capacity assessments, which are briefly described here. And I'm interested in comparing the highlights of these documents from different agencies. You can see from some of these dates that we're getting ready for the next 5-year plan. So I know some people in the Department of Interior are preparing very hard for that right now. And next slide, please. So this is an example of something at the interior level, which may filter down to maybe a practicing scientist. The capacity assessment, which is done every 5 years, and assessment of evidence building activities. So this includes quality, effectiveness, methods, analysis, research, and statistical activities, among others. And this assessment will go to a subset of department employees that have job descriptions, including those things. So this is another example of how the Evidence Act may filter down to practitioners. And next slide, please. Noting that in 2025, the evaluation plan included the priority area of USGS laboratories, and we have many activities in the USGS related to lab quality management systems and documentation of the integrity of our laboratory processes. As this screenshot shows, we have nearly 500 entities that define themselves as laboratories in the USGS, so this is a pretty huge undertaking. Okay, next slide. This slide shows some examples of the USGS level documents and resources that either reference or have high relevance to the Evidence Act. These all came out within the past 4 years. The links are in the session notes. I would love to connect with the other agencies to make sure I read their analogous resources and maybe get the relevant people in contact to leverage each other's work and knowledge. Okay, next slide. This is the point where I guess you could open the Slido poll for USGS, the USGS prompt. And it's pretty broad. It's just do you have questions about the organization or discovery of different USGS data types? How well are we implementing these open data requirements? Let us know, because we do hear things, and I want to hear things and bring them back to my programs and branches to discuss. All right, the next slide will be my second main point that I'd like you to remember from this talk, from my perspective, which is that we can stay informed of current policies and processes through our data communities, like, of course, ESIP. Another example is the USGS Community for Data Integration, or CDI. That's the data community that I'm coordinator of. And some examples of how these communities can be used for ESIP. Of course, we have this session. We have several previous federal data strategy sessions. Really use both in-person and virtual meetings and spaces to meet contacts and data teams from different agencies, and do reach out and ask us questions. That's one of the reasons why we participate in ESIP. On the CDI side, we've had recent presentations that are USGS specific about our public access plan updates and impacts for data and publications. Lots of topics on data management and metadata review, and a recent presentation on a laboratory resource that would help with documentation and evidence building. And that will bring me to the next slide and my closing points. So I hope you will remember, for the USGS, specific open data requirements are distilled down through the Department of the Interior. And that is some of the reason why we may differ from our peers here, NASA and NOAA. Second, when working with USGSers to collaboratively release or to request data, please remember this presentation and understand the context and constraints that USGSers are working under. And finally, please use your data communities like ESIP to stay engaged, ask questions, understand differences, and so we can keep working on aligning implementations where it makes sense for open earth science data. Give us more ideas during this session. Tell us what's important to you, because I was able to share my perspective. We could talk all day, and I would love to hear from anyone, including other USGSers in the session. This discussion is extremely valuable to us. So thank you.
Pause. There we go. Thank you, Leslie. That was so great. So many things. I'm sure we're all thinking about all the things, right? And we really appreciate seeing your mapping of how your agency fits in with your sub-agency. NOAA is also buried inside a department. We're in Commerce. NASA is all on its own. It doesn't have a department on top of it. So that's really interesting. So we're gonna switch to discussion mode. We are going to switch on the Slido. There will be a set of questions. We're going to ask our panel to come back on screen. And so we've got everybody back on screen. So for our participants, so you can put your questions in the chat. There's also the Slido Q&A where we see a couple of questions have been typed in. And there's a survey that's up on the Slido on the polls section. So when you're looking at Slido, you see there's a Q&A tab and then the polls. So there's a new discussion survey that's take your time, while we're discussing things. And then we'll have our final closing survey at the end. Okay. So we've got a couple of, I'm just going to put up Joe's discussion topics slide up that shows a beautiful green box of open government data assets with all the stuff attached to it. Right. And so I think maybe if I'd like to invite us to react to each other for a minute, and then we'll start looking at the questions. And the thing that I most want to react to is Leslie at the end when you're talking about different ways to engage. So, and I know I've said this a million times before, but part of the point of an ESIP session like this is I think it is one of the few communities where data dorks at all of our different types of flavors of data dork, where we can really come together to both learn and share. Right. And I love the idea of us as agencies really providing spaces. So USGS, you have your collaborative space. I'm trying to think if NOAA has something similar. We all have ESIP, but ESIP is only so big, right? But building a space for data dorks to learn and share is really top of mind. Joe, I see your mic off. You want to let's be in like panel mode right now. And so if you want to react, and we'll go around and then get to the questions. And we are still recording right now, just so you know.
Okay. Yep. Thank you. That's good. Great presentations. Thank you, Jessica and Leslie. I mean, this is awesome. I've learned a lot in the short time that we're here, and I think up front, I really like the way in which both NASA and USGS are kind of organizing, even in that broad sense of what an asset might be, the catalogs and the discovery and access elements. Jessica, you highlighted on the logical groupings slide about any kind of big changes thinking about use are interesting and challenging, right? Like we can't just make easy changes. And we talk about that a lot in NOAA as well, right? When we're talking about standard metadata fields and things like that. So I think highlighting that is worthwhile. I am super curious in kind of the broader sense. I guess before I get there, I also think there's some really good feedback both in chat and in the meeting chat as well. To Leslie, your kind of breakdown 1, 2, 3, 4 of like the federal law to like the bench science level. I think that is essential context, and we talk about that a lot when we're talking about governance and governance frameworks within NOAA around what do people really need to pay attention to? Like what is useful and important to them? And we can go way up to this top level. But in many ways, that's not always relevant to folks that are making, data management decisions at that bench level. So we want to be cognizant and aware of that. One of the things we've been talking about in NOAA is, especially when we're thinking about the fairness of data and data assets, what are the necessary tasks by whom? Who's responsible for what? We can talk a lot about data assets and things like reuse and interoperability and all these different layers of stewardship. But is that the responsibility of the person who's doing that bench science, or is that a responsibility of a data officer, a data manager somewhere down the chain, right? As some of these other decisions are being made. And I think that's an important question and component to a lot of this as well, especially when folks are providing feedback on questions like what elements of metadata are useful and important. Who's responsible for some of those things? there's a lot that's been coming in from the Slido that I would love to touch on as it relates to that as well. But I think those are just kind of my initial reactions, Jessica. Noah, Jessica. I'd love to hear from NASA Jess and Leslie too. So maybe I'll hand it to NASA Jess next.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that. I think that my biggest reaction started when we began to develop this session and continues today. And that is learning how much effort that NOAA and the DOC is currently putting into compliance and evaluation of compliance with the Evidence Act. I was not necessarily surprised, but excited to see how much activity is going on in your organizations. And I also, Joe, I want to react to your comment on whose responsibility is it? Is it the data system, the data officer versus the data producer? I think that regardless of whose responsibility it is, when we think about those logical groupings, who produces that information is going to greatly affect the results and potentially the downstream findability and discoverability. And so those are kind of two of the key points that are popping out in my head right now. And so with that, I'll pass it over to Leslie.
Thank you, NASA Jessica. A couple of the things that I noted when I was listening to the other speakers and just echoing that taking part in this session was a lot of learning that is continuing. So that is checking off that box, lots of learning. So thank you for putting the first pass NOAA definition of data asset in a kind of like more focused, usable way. So I'm interested in kind of discussing that more further because I did find in our USGS data strategy that we are reusing a NIST definition that is really quite broad, and maybe narrowing down that broadness is really going to help, especially for this application of the definition and phrase. And then the other thing that I've flagged as wanting to either follow up in now or before the July meeting or anytime is the logical grouping. I did at ESIP this week hear about NASA and NOAA using some similar backends for their metadata and data holdings and maybe some of the vocabularies. So I would really like to connect the right people from USGS who are interested to really leverage some of the discussion going on around taxonomies, definitions, all of that, and see mapping and alignment. I'll stop there for the initial reaction and things I'd love to follow up on because I want to see what the audience is weighing in as well.
So I'll jump in right at the end. I really enjoyed listening to all the presentations, and I didn't have one, but it's I like listening to them. It's good to see the different approaches. The thing that stuck out to me is sort of there are questions of, so under the Evidence Act, we have to track our data assets and sort of report on what they are, but we have questions of scale and scope. So let's say, how many data assets should an agency have? How many does NASA have? Is it 20 big ones, or is it thousands of little ones? So what is the scale of scope? And you run into the different problems from there in terms of sort of tracking all of the things. So if it's large, you may not be able to have everything meet the open government standards. So there's a question of sort of how are you lumping or splitting things there? And that also leads to the question that Joe brought up of sort of the data trap of you have data and you do science on it and suddenly you have more data. And so you've got to understand, so is that something else, or how much science do you have to do on something before you have another data asset? So it's sort of tracking and understanding how data moves between the different categories and how it can move between the different categories. So, but thank you all.